Britain has plunged into political chaos when Prime Minister Theresa May's Brexit plan was overwhelmingly rejected by the Parliament. May, however, survived a no-confidence vote after her divorce deal with the EU went down the drain on Tuesday. Europe is now deeply worried about the increased likelihood of a no-deal Brexit, with Germany saying that it will do whatever it can to prevent such a scenario. There were few clear indications of what other plans Prime Minister May might propose. Does she even have a plan B that placates the Parliament? Will she conjure up one? Is the EU willing to offer concessions to Britain to secure an agreement? These are some of the questions that we'll be asking in tonight's debate. But before that, let's get an update from Press TV's Ahmed Caballo in London. Ahmed, a no-deal Brexit or an exit with a deal? What options does the British government have at this point?
Well, Jeremy Corbyn has made it clear that he will not negotiate with Theresa May while a no-deal Brexit is still on the table. So he's essentially trying to pressure the Prime Minister into removing that option off the table. And I think that she'll eventually give in, because Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party is has the second most seats in Parliament. And essentially, without the Labour Party, no Brexit deal will be able to be put through Parliament, so she's going to have to compromise on some of the red lines. Now, I don't think a no-deal Brexit was ever likely. It was just used as a negotiation tactics to use against Brussels, who would also have consequences if Britain leaves the European Union without any sort of deal. So a no-deal Brexit was used to scare the European Union, and it was a negotiation tactic that I don't think now can ever be used.
All right, thanks a lot. Press TV's Ahmed Caballo joining us from the British capital, London. And in tonight's debate, we've got political commentator Adam Gary joining us from London, and also joining us from Bristol is Tony Gosling, investigative journalist. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with our guest in London, Mr. Gary. Does the Prime Minister have a plan B which can be palatable to the Parliament?
Well, she didn't even really have much of a plan A. And again, the problems that happen quite frequently with the earpiece is happening again, so hopefully someone can fix that. It looks like it's fixed now. So anyway, it looks like the technical issues in Mission Control Press TV are much easier to rectify than the problems that Theresa May has made for herself in respect of her Brexit debacle. But I think people really need to pull the lens out, to use another studio reference, a bit wider to see that there are three main problems that are going on right now. First of all, you've got a political class that take themselves far too seriously, but don't seem to take the people they represent seriously enough. Second of all, we've got to look at the mistake that David Cameron made in not proposing a concrete plan for what people were voting for. In countries that have legally binding referenda, as the UK doesn't, but in countries such as Switzerland or in parts of the United States where you do, when people are voting for something that changes the status quo, there is a full legal set of documents explaining, detailing and outlining what these changes will be. That didn't happen in Britain. You just had a couple of sentences where there should have been a plan from the beginning as to define what Brexit is beyond the broad definition of leaving the European Union. And finally, you've got a political class that simply does not take seriously the anger of people up and down England, in particular, in the Midlands and in the north of England. There's real anger, there's real frustration, and instead of talking to the people and going to the people in a physical sense and in a digital sense, they continue to talk amongst themselves in a London bubble with people who don't have much loyalty to the working class and lower middle class voters that rejected Brexit in most of England, except for London and a few other urban areas. And because of these problems, you have the total mess that there is now, where a government that doesn't know how to go one way doesn't seem to even know how to reverse and go in the next.
Mr. Gosling, the Prime Minister is holding meetings with various party leaders, as well as Tory Brexiteers and the DUP, both of whom rejected her withdrawal deal earlier this week. At this point, what is the government willing to compromise on?
Well, I don't think they're going to compromise on anything, actually, apart from possibly the backstop, because in Northern Ireland they're relying on the DUP's Northern Irish votes in order to keep them in power. They may have to compromise on that. But I think Adam's actually just touched on something very important, which is quite right, that the referendums in Britain, referenda, are not legally binding. The only thing is that we passed something called the EU Withdrawal Act 2018, which passed with a big majority through the Houses of Parliament, and that means that there will be a no deal. Britain will leave on the 29th of March unless there's fresh legislation passed, and that actually looks very unlikely because the government is in the driving seat when it comes to allowing legislation and the legislative programme to go through the House of Commons. And actually there has been an attempt to stop the no deal. That's by Dominic Grieve, Conservatives. But you see, this has been passed by Parliament, but it doesn't have any legal effect. That's at least what even the parliamentary lawyers have been telling us, because it doesn't change this initial law, which says we leave on the 29th of March. Incidentally, Dominic Grieve is the chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee, so he is extremely close to MI5 and MI6. And many people have pointed to this and said, well, actually, this looks like the intelligence services have given him this amendment to put to Parliament. But anyway, apparently what we're hearing, even from Parliament itself, is that this has no legal standing, so that means we leave on the 29th of March. This looks actually much more likely than your correspondent was hinting. The only thing that I think will stop that is if we have another extension to Article 50, which may well not happen, may simply well not happen. We've got a major problem. The main spanner in the works, I think, is this whole business of the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, the DUP and the backstop. Because actually what the DUP are doing is they're completely contradictory. They're saying they don't want a border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, and neither do they want a border across the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and Britain. So they're contradicting themselves, and nobody really seems to have managed to persuade them to explain what they mean, because they want to be in both countries at the same time. Until that one is sorted out, I think we will not have a deal, because the Northern Irish are absolutely key. And so all of this means that many of the preparations, and we're hearing today as well in France, preparations are now being made for a no deal, which at the moment is the most likely outcome in all this, I believe.
Mr. Gary, it's obvious that Parliament is deeply divided over the Brexit. Now, if I'm correct, this is how the process will be. Prime Minister Theresa May will offer her Plan B, whether she comes up with something by then, and then it's going to be debated for a whole day, and then the lawmakers will be offering their proposals. What alternatives and compromises will the lawmakers be presenting before this Plan B actually goes to a vote?
Well, there isn't much that logically could be amended other than a Norway or a Swiss-style agreement, which essentially means remaining in the EU in all but name, as Norway and Switzerland, albeit to a slightly lesser extent, are in the EU in all but name. So apart from that, apart from extending Article 50, which is just a legalese expression, which means staying in the EU until people in Parliament can agree on what Brexit is, and then the other option, the third option, is crashing out with no deal, which wouldn't really mean the saga ends. It would merely be the end of the beginning, because it would force Britain to do what they should have done from the beginning and negotiate not just with the old partners of the EU, but negotiate in earnest and with an open mind and with creativity with other partners throughout the world, particularly China, the powers of South Asia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and beyond that. But this is one of the fundamental flaws, not just of Brexit, but of the current crop of politicians on all sides of the British House of Commons. There's simply no imagination. Small minds come up with small proposals, and small proposals have small impacts. This is the problem. Whether one wants to revitalize a relationship with the EU or Brexit out the hard way with WTO rules, both of these things have got to be done with some sort of political creativity. possibility, and there isn't any. It really is a zombified parliament, a zombified government, but making things even more ironic, zombies eat brains. So I think you should picture in your mind some emaciated zombies in those hallowed chambers where the green benches sit.
Tony Gosling, you're shaking your head there.
Well,
Would you like to add anything?
The reason is because actually Parliament needs to just step out of the way. What's happened here is the British people have voted 2 years ago to leave the European Union, and that means that we have to keep. I mean, this is one of the things that amazes me about Jeremy Corbyn in the opposition party, who I think are committing political suicide in the tactics that they're adopting at the moment. They're saying that we should be taking no deal off the table. Well, that's our main bargaining chip. That is the main reason that we're actually at the table. Is we're saying, look, if you don't do a deal with this, then we will have a no deal, and that will mean you won't get any of your nearly £40 billion that you need in order to balance the European Union's budget. And so that's our main chip. Jeremy Corbyn is saying, take that away. I think we also have to understand the oligarchy hate Brexit. I mean, I spoke a couple of years ago to one of the directors of Goldman Sachs. That's what we're talking about here, the banksters, really. And he actually started shouting and swearing at me when I even mentioned Brexit. They hate the idea. And one of the reasons is because the oligarchy has been getting more and more powerful in the West. The referendum fits in very interestingly with voter turnout here in Britain, which has been going down and down since the Maastricht Treaty, since the late 80s and early 90s. It used to be around 75%. In 2000, in the Tony Blair election, the voter turnout went right down to 59%. So people are getting more and more apathetic and disillusioned with elections. In the 2016 referendum, we saw it leap back up to 75%. What this is hinting at is that our general elections are not making any difference to people's lives, and they're getting apathetic. But they do believe that an exit from the European Union, as they voted for 2 years ago, will make a difference, and that's why they turned out. So Parliament needs to just get out of the way and implement that referendum decision, which was put into legal force during the 2018 in the EU Withdrawal Act, and that's why. It's not a zombie parliament, and they're not zombies. What they need to do is actually do what Theresa May, I think, possibly is doing at the moment, which is trying to make sure, by hook or by crook, the referendum is actually implemented, the result of that referendum, on the 29th of March. And that will give the EU something to think about when they have a £40 billion hole in their budget. I think they will be forced to the table possibly in the last few days and sign up to something like a Canada plus deal, which the former Brexit Secretary David Davis has been recommending. But we'll have to wait and see. Something may well happen just in the last few days.
Adam Gary, Labour wants a permanent customs union with the EU, which they believe would also resolve the Irish backstop. Most of the Conservative lawmakers, they reject a customs union because it would prevent Britain from having an independent trade policy. These are views that are on the opposite sides of the beam. Will the chasm be closed, and will it happen in time?
It's very unlikely. When you look at how they took 2 years to negotiate absolutely nothing and to achieve absolutely nothing, it wouldn't be a wise bet to think that they're going to do it in, what is it, a month and a half, a bit more than that. It's simply not very likely. There's always a possibility that some such compromise will be made, but it just simply doesn't look likely. Look at all the time they've wasted, and even now they should have been working through Christmas, but like a bunch of lazy layabouts, they took the holiday off. No Scrooge am I, but frankly, if the people who rule the country aren't willing to work for the country, what do they expect of the rest of us? So I think that that was a mistake. The delay, I think that there's a great likelihood that nothing will happen between now and the end of March, except for either in a sort of shrugging of shoulders where people say, okay, there's going to be a WTO-style Brexit, or in the other extreme, there'll just be an extension of the negotiating period by remaining in the EU, by saying we're going to extend Article 50, something that the EU has previously said is possible and that a lot of people in the UK Parliament are now hinting at as well.
Tony Gosling, Adam Gary believes that there's not enough time to sow the schism. What do you think?
Well, look, one of the solutions which is being put forward all over the place here in Britain is to have a second referendum. And this is what the oligarchy normally do. If they don't get the result they wanted, then they have a second referendum. And they keep going until they do. They did this in Ireland, they've done it elsewhere when it was the time for the EU constitution. Quite a lot of people across Europe actually voted against the EU constitution. So they just changed the name to the Lisbon Treaty, and they came back for more and more votes, put a lot more propaganda out, and then they got their way. But the second referendum here, I don't think people will stomach it. Of course, this means there has been 2 years of propaganda, which has been mostly anti-Brexit, pro-oligarchy, pro-EU. Let's remember that the big media companies are mostly part of the corporate media, and they have their money in tax havens, and they are not interested in national governments. They would much rather be running the show, and many of their bankster friends are running the show, so they're not really interested in any kind of separation. They want to see Brussels. In fact, they're very close to Brussels. In BBC, for example, are partly funded by Brussels. So the voters also are dying. So that is something like 1.5 million voters who voted in the last referendum will now be dead. Now, this is our elders of our tribe. You know, the elders of society are dying. These are the people that can remember the days before the European Economic Community. We entered in 1973 under Edward Heath, who forced us in, and then we had a referendum back in 75, which was to remain. So those people who can remember the days before and have seen what the EU has done to Britain, that 1.5 million of those will be dead. And what they're doing is they're appealing to impressionable young people, hoping that lots and lots of young people will come along, buy the propaganda and vote Remain. But that's by no means guaranteed. Certainly, a second referendum would be a complete betrayal of the country and a betrayal of trust in politics, and may solve absolutely nothing.
Adam Gary, we spoke of opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn's red line, which is quite clear. His condition for talks is a pledge to block a no-deal Brexit. Can you elaborate on the issue for us and our viewers about the consequences of a no-deal Brexit and what happens in that case? For starters, we know that trade with the EU would default to basic WTO rules. How much pain are we looking at for the British economy?
Well, it depends on how the business community reacts. I mean, you frankly just answered your own question. What happens in a no-deal Brexit is that the existing single market and customs union that right now Britain is in will still exist, but Britain will cease to be a member, and the only agreements in place for trade between the European Union and UK will be those fundamental ones laid down in the WTO. But just as many nations in the WTO have trade agreements with each other over and beyond that which is in the WTO, there's always a possibility that Britain could negotiate for a trade deal over and above those basic rules with the EU, and hopefully they would do so with even more vigor in respect of China and in respect of ASEAN and in respect of other countries where economic growth and productivity is really something quite marvelous. The EU is largely a stagnant place, and with the exception of Germany, not a great deal of interesting economic activity is going on when one looks to the broader future as opposed to just the near term. And so if a WTO-style Brexit were to happen, of course, Britain, like every country, should try to trade as much as possible with every other country in the world. But I honestly think the priorities ought to be looking at where to take things with the great economic blocs and powers of Asia rather than the EU. Obviously, there's plenty of time for both. There's plenty of envoys to do both things, so long as they can find one who's sufficiently cranially active. But so long as those requirements are met, let the negotiations begin. The idea that after a hard Brexit, negotiations just stop and everything gets frozen. People are negotiating all the time. Unless you're the Pentagon, of course, everything in life is negotiable, as well it should be. The only people who set things in stone in the temporal world are those who try to play God, and that, of course, is blasphemy.
All right, Mr. Gosling, will a no-deal Brexit put the British economy down for the count?
Depends which economists you ask about this, but look, let's remember we're not in the Eurozone. We have our pound still, so we're insulated from that. the former Bank of England Governor Mervyn King, who I actually got a lot of respect for. He's somebody who worked his way up in the old-fashioned way. His father was a railway porter. He went to grammar school up in Worcester, and he's saying that it will be almost no economic effect at all from Brexit because of the fact that we will be, the demand will still be there from the UK, and so we will actually be increasing manufacturing here in Britain, so people will be able to get their products from Britain, and this will do a lot to help and maybe increase jobs here in the UK and start to, bring our own industrial policy back to Britain again, which we haven't had really since we joined the EEC, and this is what many people warned about in the early 70s, said, look, many of our policies are now going to be decided in Brussels. But look, let's not forget, you can ask the French. They've been having these Gilets jaunes marches for the last couple of months now, or month and a bit, and they are for Frexit. They have also decided that the control from Brussels is not going to work for them, and they want to leave too. So it's actually only the British that have been given the chance to have this vote, and now there's lots of people who are on the gravy train, many people who are expecting, who MPs, who they are just getting a job as an MP for a while and then they want to go into big business. They're much more loyal to the big business than they are to their voters and to the people, their own constituents, and those lot will, I'm afraid, probably lose their jobs as a result of this, and they can see that lovely gravy train disappearing with Brexit. So it always depends who you ask. I actually think we will probably, though, be hit hard economically, because the oligarchy are very powerful. I've studied the Bilderberg conferences for many years, and if you look at the people there, they control most of the money in the Western world.
Sure.
They're completely anonymous. Nobody knows who these people are. They never come onto TV, but they hate this, and they will hit us hard as they can. They want to make sure that Britain is made an example of, so that other countries in the EU don't try and follow us.
So we're reaching the end of the show, and we've got time for one last question. Very briefly, if you may. Gentlemen, let's start with Mr. Gary. A no-deal Brexit or an exit with a deal? What's your prediction? One of these two, or is there another viable option in your opinion?
I'm too honest to make such a prediction because at the rate things are going, no one knows what they're doing. And in the words of Kenneth Clarke, a man who I have some different views on, but I nevertheless respect, he said, don't listen to what anyone's saying. No one knows what is going on. So my only advice is for people to make sure that they have plenty of empty cans stacked up, because there's going to be a lot of hot air going around.
Okay, Mr. Gosling, your predictions.
Yeah, well, I think what we may well see is an extension of Article 50. So that just to kick the can down the road a while. But one of I think maybe even more likely than that is a last-minute deal, a Canada plus deal, so to make sure that the EU get their 39 billion, because they'll be in all sorts of trouble. The Eurozone is in trouble anyway. There's no growth hardly in the Eurozone now, and so they really need that 40 billion pounds, and I think they may sign some sort of compromise Canada plus deal right at the last minute.
That's all the time we have for tonight's show. Thanks to my guest, political commentator Adam Gary, joining us from the British capital, London, and also thanks to investigative journalist Tony Gosling joining us from Bristol, and also special thanks to you, our viewers, for staying with us. Tune in, same time, same place, for another edition of The Debate. It's good night for now. Bye, everybody.